Okay, everybody, welcome back to another video lecture. I'm Mr. Gregory. Today we're doing our second part of our Absolutism in England unit. Last time we talked about King Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, how they always listened to Parliament or the people, and then we learned about how James I and Charles I refused to listen to Parliament, often dissolved it, and this ends up with Charles I losing his life in the English Civil War. Okay, so what happens to England after Oliver Cromwell? Well, Cromwell didn't go over so well in England. The English people kind of realized that they made a mistake. They want a king back. So they invite Charles I's son, remember the guy they killed? They invite his son back to lead England, and his name is, you guessed it, Charles II. So Charles returns to England, London, in 1660. He was actually very popular because he opened up theaters, like Cromwell had closed. He opened up taverns, like Cromwell had closed, and he presided over a very lively court. He reestablished the Church of England. He encouraged the toleration of Protestants, which were Quakers, Presbyterians, Baptists. But probably the most important thing about Charles II is that he accepted the Petition of Right. Remember that thing from the last lecture? It said that the king could not just dissolve Parliament whenever they wanted. He accepted that. With that said, he still believed in absolute monarchy, and he was Catholic. So Charles, he didn't make the same mistakes his father did about being brash with Parliament, open about Catholicism, rejecting the Petition of Right. Instead, he kind of faked it. Even though he stayed Catholic in his private life, he was very accepting of Protestants. Even though he thought he had absolute power, he just entertained Parliament and said, yeah, I'll let you have a say. So that's the way it was under Charles. Charles's brother, James II, is going to inherit the throne in 1685. Now, he was different from his brother. He openly practiced his Catholic faith. Not only that, he appointed other Catholics to high offices in England. This made a lot of absolutists or members of the Church of England, Protestants, very upset with James II. James II also would just suspend a law on a whim. Hey, I just feel like suspending laws. I'll just do this and that and that. That's the way James was. Parliament got really, really scared about this. Parliament feared a possible restoration of the Roman Catholic Church in England. Remember, England, after King Henry VIII, broke away from the Catholic Church, okay, and they became the Church of England. There's a fear with James II that England could go back to being Catholic. So the people are very scared that they can go back to Catholicism. So in 1688, Parliament's fears of James II led them to invite James's Protestant daughter, Mary, and her Dutch husband, William, to become the rulers of England. Once again, Mary was Protestant, and she married William III of the Netherlands. Okay? This is the famous William and Mary. You might have heard of that college. Well, when James heard that William and Mary were being invited to come back and be the King and Queen of England, James feared for his life. So James II fled to France, which was sympathetic to Catholics. Now, this bloodless overthrow of a king became known as the Glorious Revolution. This is actually a really important event. Before, when the English overthrew a king, he lost his head. But in this case, James II did not lose his head. He fled peacefully to France. Now, he feared for his life, but nothing actually happened to him. So this bloodless overthrow, meaning he didn't shed any blood, he wasn't harmed, he wasn't killed, is called the Glorious Revolution. And it's significant because it was a change of power, especially monarchy, without shedding any blood. That's the Glorious Revolution. But before being crowned, William and Mary had to accept several acts of Parliament. This was the condition of them becoming King and Queen of England. In 1689, the English Bill of Rights was presented to William and Mary. The English Bill of Rights is very important because, like the Magna Carta and the Petition of Right before it, it limited the power of the king and it gave more say and more power to Parliament and the people. The English Bill of Rights says a few things. Number one, superiority of Parliament over the monarch. So you got Parliament up here and the monarch here. Parliament must be summoned regularly by the king. The king cannot just summon them anytime he wants money. It must be regularly. The House of Commons got the power of the purse, or we can call that control over spending. The king couldn't spend the money, Parliament had to. Finally, the monarch could not interfere in parliamentary debates or suspend laws whenever he wanted to. So overall, the key part of the English Bill of Rights is it limited the king's power and gave more power to Parliament and the people. Even though the Magna Carta tried to do this and the Petition of Right tried to do this, the English Bill of Rights was effective in limiting the king's power. It was a Bill of Rights with teeth, so to speak. Some of the other things that the English Bill of Rights said were very important too. For example, no Roman Catholics could ever inherit the throne ever again in England. Now think about it. That makes sense. According to the Act of Supremacy, if you are the monarch of England, you are the head of the Church of England. It doesn't really make sense for you to have a Catholic running the Church of England. So the English Bill of Rights said, if you want to be the monarch of England, you must be a member of the Church of England. You cannot be Roman Catholic. The English Bill of Rights also said that English citizens had a right to trial by jury. It also abolished excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishments. Citizens could not be held in prison without being charged with a crime. This is very important. You could not just be thrown in jail on suspicion. You had to be charged with a crime. This is a big step for the English at this point. We take this for granted in America, but these ideas really started at this time in England. Finally, the Toleration Act was passed in 1689, and this granted limited religious freedom to non-Anglicans, except for, you guessed it, Catholics. Let's talk a little bit more about a limited monarchy. The Glorious Revolution, because James II fled without any bloodshed, allowed this limited monarchy to happen under the English Bill of Rights. What is a limited monarchy? Well, basically, it's when a constitution or legislative body limits the power of the monarch. So when you're going to limit the monarch's power, there has to be a document that explicitly states how the power is going to be limited. One other key attribute of a limited monarchy is the fact that the king is not above the law. The king is still subject to all the laws that every other English citizen was subject to. This was a radical idea during the age of absolutism in Europe. Look at Louis XIV in France, look at Frederick II in Prussia, look at Peter the Great in Russia. They all had absolute power. Philip II of Spain, they all had no limits to their power. But after the English Bill of Rights, the rest of Europe starts to take note that putting more power in the hands of the people might actually be a good idea. During this age of absolutism, a limited monarchy was a strange and foreign new idea. Now, the other thing that the English Bill of Rights does is it creates a constitutional government. A constitutional government is simply when government power is defined and also limited by law. So government power is defined by law, it's also limited by law. That's a constitutional government. We see that with the English Bill of Rights in England, and of course we see that today in the United States with our current government. Now, because England has a constitutional government at this time, three new political institutions arise. Number one, political parties. You've got the Tories and you've got the Whigs. Okay? Tories were aristocrats. They tended to be upper class, wealthy, dressed nice, merchant class, bankers, people of high esteem. And then there were Whigs, W-H-I-G-S, and they tended to be commoners, peasants. Another institution arises out of constitutional government, the cabinet system. Now, the cabinet system is very simple. Basically, it's a group of advisors for the king. And then finally, you have the prime minister. The prime minister is probably the closest thing in English government to our president. They are the chief official of the British government and the leader of the majority party in the House of Commons. The first Prime Minister of England is Robert Walpole. He's going to be Prime Minister from 1721 to 1742. But the major difference between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Great Britain is the President of the United States is both the head of state and the head of government. And in Britain, the Prime Minister is solely the head of government. They are not the head of state. That belongs to the monarch. So although constitutional government was based on democracy, the government was actually much more like an oligarchy. Now, what is an oligarchy? Sounds like some crazy word that you don't want to learn, but you have to. An oligarchy is a type of government in which ruling power belongs to just a few people. How does that affect Britain in this constitutional government? Well, rich landowners held seats in the House of Lords, and many of those people controlled elections. The right to vote was limited only to landowning men. So of course they're going to vote for more landowning men. They're not going to vote for any peasants or other commoners. And the division between the wealthy and the middle class commoners would only expand during this time. What does this teach us? Well, even though the British set up a government that gave more power to the people, it really only gave more power to certain people. And usually those people end up being the more elite or the rich. So what I want you to do now is answer a couple of focus questions about our lecture today. Number one, what was the Glorious Revolution? Tell me what it was. Why is it significant? Second question, how did absolute monarchy evolve into a limited monarchy in England? Tell me the process in which absolute monarchs became limited monarchs. Third, what three political institutions contributed to the evolution of Britain's constitutional government? Tell me about the three new political institutions. Alright, well I hope you enjoyed this video lecture. If you have any questions, I should be circulating around here somewhere, probably with a pretty bad shirt and tie combo. But if you need any help, raise your hand and I'd be glad to help you. John, stop sleeping, okay? It's really important that you stop sleeping. Maroney, you cannot go to the bathroom. Alright, I'm out of here. Woo!